Thank you for that welcome. David, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I want to say before I start, and I began to say this in the room, that before I start asking you questions, I just want to say, and I say this a lot when I do my reporting to people who have survived, who have lost loved ones, I'm sorry that you had to go through this. I'm sorry that as a kid you went to schools where active shooter drills were part of the deal, and that you had to be exposed to this kind of unspeakable tragedy. It shouldn't be like that. So with that in mind, this seems like an awful transition, but we learned today 3 children, 3 adults killed in the latest school shooting, this one in Nashville. This is America's 90th school shooting this year, according to the K-12 school shooting database. We know that something like 100 people will die today as a result of gun violence. We know that most gun deaths are caused by suicide, but active shooter incidents like the one that happened in your high school in Parkland and like the one that happened today in Nashville have become more and more common over the years. So given all of that, are you discouraged? And if not, I want to hear how you keep the faith in this cause that I know you are so committed to.
Obviously, on some days, I'm less hopeful than others. But I've always seen hope as not an option here, or not. It doesn't matter if I'm hopeful or not. It doesn't matter if the issue is getting worse. There's nothing that is going to stop me from doing this, because I looked at people like Manuel Oliver, whose son died in the Parkland shooting, Joaquin. Manuel and Joaquin and their family came here fleeing violence in Venezuela, and they went to Parkland specifically because it was the safest school and the best school that they could find in South Florida, only to have their son, along with his American dream and their family's American dream, slaughtered in my high school. When I can see that Manny, just as I was a couple days ago when I was with him in DC, is able to keep going, how could I ever stop, right? And I also think it's important to acknowledge that it's not on any single one of us. I came here straight from class, right? I can't be thinking about this 24/7. None of us can, and that's okay. None of us can be doing this 24/7 either. When I need to take a step back, I know that Manny is out there doing the work, and Manny knows that when he needs to take a step back because he has to deal with the unbearable grief of being a father who had a child stolen from him by gun violence, that I'm out there doing the work along with thousands of other people, and it's not on any one of us. And that's why I think we keep up the momentum, along with just really having, unfortunately, a really big club of people who never wished to join that club.
Right.
But nonetheless, we found connection and family through our trauma. And that trauma can be a very strong bonding force, but it can also be very harmful if it's not handled properly. So we learn we essentially learn how to sink or swim. You either learn how to take care of yourself and continue doing this work, or you burn out within the first couple of years and basically are on permanent hiatus.
So when that shooting took place in Parkland, you were a senior. You were on the school debating team studying TV production, but I gather you weren't expecting to suddenly be thrust into, to become a spokesman for a national movement, essentially. And I want to play a clip from 2018. This is some days after the shooting. It's of you and Emma Gonzalez, one of your classmates. You're being remarkably poised. Now keep in mind, David here is a senior in high school, being grilled by the national press, including CNN, and we've got a clip to play right now.
People are going to keep saying, oh, this is just another shooting, it's never going to happen to me. But what happens is when you don't take action, things like this eventually will happen to you. And that's not acceptable, and that's why I call on people to stand up, talk to the congressman, talk to people, and don't stop fighting, because children will continue to die if we don't take a stand now. What we really need is action, because we can say, yes, we're going to do all these things, thoughts and prayers. What we need more than that is action. Please, this is the 18th one this year. That's unacceptable. We're children. You guys are the adults. You need to take some action and play a role. Work together, come over your politics, and get something.
So did you realize at that moment where this movement was going and how involved you were going to be? Because that was just a very short time after the shooting.
I don't know if we realized where the movement was going or where we would be. We were just furious. We were incredibly upset that this had happened to us. I think I was also upset given that I knew about things like gun control and had never really acted on it before despite not being able to vote. You know, I could have gone to Tallahassee at my state legislature and lobbied because I knew about it because of TV, because of speech and debate. I had to argue on both sides in previous years on whether or not we should have school resource officers to prevent school shootings, whether or not we should have universal background checks. And I, unlike many people in my high school, had the privilege of being able to take that class and knowing about these things, which is why you see me out there, especially in the early days, speaking out, because all the students were doing whatever they were best at. I happen to have experience in TV production and speech and debate, so I went out there as the policy person, basically, and just talked about these things and what we could do. Meanwhile, other people like Jacqueline Corin, who goes to Harvard with me, were behind the scenes and they were helping to organize buses to go up to Tallahassee because they were our student body president. We were all kind of fitting into our own little specialization, and that's why you saw me out there a lot. I was just doing what I knew how to do best.
So with March for Our Lives, you raised money, you raised awareness, you successfully pushed for gun legislation in Florida and across the country. Can you talk a little bit about what you wanted to accomplish in those early days of March for Our Lives and what you've managed to actually do and what you're proudest of?
Yeah, well, obviously we wanted to end gun violence. But beyond that, I think we wanted to create a cultural shift within our generation that negated the ageist stereotype, frankly, that young people don't care about politics. Trust me, we care. It's literally getting us killed, right? We wanted to change that and show our generation that we aren't powerless to address this. We can run for office. We can vote. We can vote out these politicians. We can vote against the people that enable this to continue because they try to act like, oh, it's because we have doors that gun violence is continuing in our country. Oh, it's mental illness. Oh, it's X, Y, or Z thing. All these other things that every other country has. We wanted to create a cultural shift within our generation that it is not an exception, but an expectation that you are politically engaged, not because it's a choice, but because you have to, because our lives are literally on the line. And I think that is part of what we did. Now, I think in the beginning, we had a basic set of policy ideas, obviously, like banning assault weapons and other things like that. And I think we've added a lot of nuance to our policies. I think in the time since, what we've been able to do is on the political front, Gen Z has become a political force. This is we are at a turning point in our nation's history right now. Whether or not we choose to realize it, frankly, doesn't matter because it's happening. In that young people are voting in record numbers, not just in 2018, but in 2020 and in 2022 as well, consistently at the highest rates ever in American history. Importantly though, it's not just 50-50. In the year 2000, young people between the ages of 18 and 29 voted about 50% for Bush and 50% for Gore. In the previous election, young people in your average congressional election not only were voting at a substantially higher rate, they were disproportionately voting by 20 plus points for progressives. They're very clearly voting in one direction, and it shows obviously some of the force of Gen Z, because with that, it's barely been within the first 5 years of the organization, we elected our first member of Congress, Maxwell Frost. He was our second in command at March for Our Lives as our national organizing director. I remember Maxwell being in Las Vegas with me when I had to fly out in the middle of my freshman year because we were having a presidential debate with all the people in the Democratic primary. And Maxwell came up to me because he was running advance for Bernie Sanders' campaign at the time, and he basically asked me for a job. And I essentially gave him some brief, I basically ran through what are all the mistakes that I've made, and I asked him the top 3 that I could think of, and I said, how would you respond to X, Y, and Z? And then based off of that, I was like, okay, cool, I think we'll move forward with you to hire you. And then he became our national organizing director. Called me up a couple of years after he was hired, and he said, David, I want to run for Congress. I'm not a millionaire or anything, and I said, you got my full support. And with him, he was couch surfing and Uber driving. As I was on kitchen cabinet calls with him last year in my dining hall at 9 a.m. every Thursday morning. And now I was just in his office with Manuel and Patricia Oliver, Joaquin's parents, in Congress. How could I not be hopeful when that's the case? right? And that's one of 435 members of Congress, but guess what? We have the most valuable thing you can have on your side in politics that the Koch brothers even can't buy more of.
And what's that?
Time. We're going to outlive the Supreme Court, right? The question is, are we going to repeat the same mistakes, and are we going to allow the same power structures in place that enabled them to bring our country to the place it's in now?
You also reminded me the other day that, I mean, it's easy to look at the stalemate in Washington over gun control and how impossible it is to move things through the Senate because of the filibuster, but you reminded me, you had an accurate count that I didn't, of the number of pro-gun control legislation, pieces of legislation that have passed through various legislatures around the country, right?
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that.
No, go ahead.
There's so many success now.
This is my job.
Right, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of my own point that I brought up. So we also passed over, and when I say we, of course, I would like to think that March was the factor that enabled this to change. Because if you look at a graph of the gun laws that were passed after Sandy Hook, when this really should have ended, for sure, it spikes, and then it goes down. And it just stays really low for a while. And then Parkland happens. It spikes, and it stayed relatively stable at that level. And because of that, we've been able to pass over 250 gun laws and gun regulations at the state level. March for Our Lives, despite the common misconception that we have the funding of some of the much bigger organizations in the movement, we don't. We're kind of like the, this is not the greatest metaphor, but I always refer to us as like the cutest girl in high school who doesn't get asked out to prom because everybody thinks she's already been asked out. We have a lot of name ID, but we don't have anywhere near the funding to match the level of public awareness that people have of us. So if you want to donate, you can go to marchforourlives.com/donate. But the point that I'm getting at is that it's not just us. It's all these other organizations that have been doing it for a long time. Brady has been out, obviously, for a long time. Everytown, Giffords, and a lot of these other organizations have been out there, along with a lot of community-based organizations in Black and brown communities that have been doing this far longer than any of the national organizations who really pioneered the gun violence prevention movement, and we cannot leave out of the conversation because they were the ones who started the conversation.
So real progress has been made, but this epidemic of gun violence across the country, it hasn't abated. I know you've been thinking about where your movement has to go. And the other day, I'm coming clean. I had a nice long talk with David the other day about some of the points we wanted to discuss, and it was fascinating and revelatory in a lot of ways. But one of the things you told me the other day was that for this movement, so far, this movement has been too reactive. And that what we really need is a seismic shift around this movement. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. First of all, how has it been reactive?
So what I mean by that is, and I think it's honestly a product of, there's a lot of nuance to what I'm about to say, but I think part of it is a problem with the incentives that nonprofits have and the nonprofit industrial complex in our country, and that there's always this surge and outrage that we have after, like happened today, right? Where everybody's like, what the hell? We need to do something. We need to get fired up and angry and screw all these people and, do something, right? That is, on average, I like the idea behind that, right? I like that we're getting fired up, but the reality is, and this is really unfortunate, what actually happens in reality is that you would think after these shootings, on average, gun laws get stronger, right? That's not the case. On average, state gun laws, after there's been a mass shooting, get weaker. And the reason why that happens is because we raise all this outrage. We go on Twitter, we tweet, we post on Instagram, Facebook, dealer's choice of social media platforms. And there's this huge counter backlash to us from the gun rights people that is much more sustained than we are. They show up every single year for decades at state legislatures with basically a number of people that's probably about the size of this room, if not 2 people, every single year at their state legislature. When there's a mass shooting, they're still showing up, even if the media has gone away and most of us in this room aren't tweeting or posting about it anymore. What we need to do is we need to start showing up every single year, not just young people, an intergenerational coalition of people, because unfortunately, They still think that young people don't vote and don't matter, even if they're literally losing their elections or winning them because of us. What we need is people of all ages to join us, and there have been people of all ages with us from the beginning, but what I mean is, we need more people the people that come up to me and say, wow, David, you're such an inspiration, like, March for Our Lives, and you young people are so amazing, my generation really messed up, thank God you're here to save us. I need those people to stop thanking me and start marching with me. You know, and it doesn't mean that there haven't been people that have been. There are people that have been doing this work far longer than I have. People like Erica Ford in Jamaica, Queens, and New York City, and especially other Black and brown women that have led this fight for decades before me. But I need those people who come up to me and do not thank me. I would much rather have you marching hand in hand with me. And then let's thank each other after we've won, and kids don't have to go through school shooter drills anymore. And kids don't have to fear for their lives or walk over bloodstained sidewalks on their way to school, where most kids die outside of school, right? That's what I mean about being reactive. Being proactive. We need to show up there before there's a shooting. Just recently, March for Our Lives started to make this shift ourselves. This past week, on the 5th anniversary of the march, we had rallies at state capitals around the country. Not in every one, because once again, we don't have that kind of funding of some of these other organizations. But we showed up, and it was only a couple hundred people that showed up with us in Tallahassee. Right? It was only a couple hundred people that were able to show up with us in Lansing. It was only a couple hundred people that showed up with us in Sacramento. And granted, that's only a couple hundred people. I would take those people any day over having 1 million people with us there one day. Because those, as we've seen, you can literally have millions of people marching in the streets with us, demanding change. But if we don't have a sustained effort, you know who does? The gun rights lobby and the cartel of death that makes more money by these shootings continuing. Because the reality is, guns aren't like a normal product that just break down really quickly over time. It's really hard because they're not like an iPhone where the battery dies after 2 years. There are 400 million of these things in this country, and the only way that they can sell more of them and keep their shareholders happy is by loosening gun laws, increasing gun violence, and creating an America where everybody feels like they have to be armed so that they don't die in an instance of gun violence. That is what they're pushing us toward, is an armed anarchist dystopia.
So I'm really intrigued about your message and how you're thinking about the message, because one of the perverse things, and you touched upon this, is when there's a mass shooting, there's outrage, people tweet, nothing happens legislatively, but what does happen is the gun lobby gets the message loud and clear that people like you want to take everybody's guns away, right? That's the message that they sell. And so guess what happened? Gun sales spike. Now there are 400 million guns all around America, and that number is going to continue to rise. So is there something that you all can do about the messaging that can somehow convince the Second Amendment crowd that you're not coming for all of their guns? Is that a necessary consideration?
Yeah, I think it is. I think when I have conversations with a lot of the people who don't agree with us, putting aside the fact of what a logistical nightmare it would be to take away 400 million guns, even if we had the political capital to do that. I've talked with armed counter-protesters before. When I was 18 years old in Dallas, Texas, we were doing a bus tour around the country to help register more young people to vote and turn young people out in districts that historically young people had not voted that much in, so that the idea being that they could defeat an NRA-backed incumbent there if they just voted a little bit more. And from that, we defeated more NRA-backed politicians than ever before in American history. But at a lot of these events, we were protested by armed counter-protesters, men and women, often twice our age, with an AR-15 bigger than some of my classmates that were, with us essentially, or some of the people that were at, the rally. And at one of these events in Dallas, Texas, I went out and talked to them, and they said, they were shouting my name, calling me a crisis actor, saying that I'm a paid CIA informant, which honestly is kind of flattering. I'm not gonna lie. If you think, if you think that us as a group of teenagers are so effective, your only answer is you're the CIA, we're doing something right. I went out and talked to these people, and I remember going up to one man in particular and saying, why are you here right now? And he said, well, you're trying to take away our guns. It's like, wow, I haven't heard that one before. And I said, well, are you trying to hurt yourself or somebody else? And he said, no. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not trying to take away your gun. And if I was, it would be through a court order with a right to due process and counsel. Because right now, do you think, sir, that right now somebody who threatens to shoot up your local high school and owns the gun that you're holding should be able to continue to legally own that gun if they've threatened to shoot up that high school multiple times? And he said, no, of course not. Well, I said, guess what? They can in Texas. And right now, the reason we're in Dallas is because we're trying to stop Dallas from becoming the next Parkland. Because the reality is, the shooter at my high school legally obtained his AR-15 and threatened to shoot up my school multiple times. And on top of that, just recently at the time, somebody had sent a death threat to my own mom that said, F with the NRA and you'll be DOA, an NRA supporter. We used the law that we passed after Parkland to disarm that individual. That same law has now been used over 9,000 times since Parkland, right? And I said, can you agree with that? And he said, yeah, with due process and counsel. I was like, yes. He's like, yeah, I do agree with that. Of course, he didn't agree to ban something like the AR-15 that he was holding, but he ended up crying.
Yeah.
And I found myself having to comfort the man that just minutes prior was literally an armed protester yelling at us, denying our own survivorship. I was now finding myself having to comfort this man who was at least twice my weight and a couple inches taller than me, holding his AR-15 as he was crying, realizing that the people he was protesting weren't paid CIA informants or something, were kids, or barely adults at the time, because I was 18. And all we want is for our friends not to die from gun violence anymore, which is also what he wants, in a different way, obviously. But
So there's a good audience question here, which gets to a point that I wanted to talk to you about. In a state with strict gun control laws like Massachusetts, and by the way, we could add with some of the lowest gun-related violence in the country, some of this discussion can feel very far away. What can we do to help with this issue locally and nationwide?
Well, for one, we need a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of schools in Boston. We need a lot more policy research on other things that we can do and making sure that Massachusetts isn't done fighting until nobody dies in the state from gun violence or gun-related deaths. And I think it is possible. With that, too, I think there is nuance that's needed in this conversation. Very often, liberals tend to only talk about how somebody gets a gun, and conservatives try to talk about why somebody pulls the trigger. And I think that there's a third way that we need to be talking about this that includes aspects of both conversations. We have to address how somebody like the shooter at my high school was able to legally obtain an AR-15. But we also need to address the fact that prior to the shooter at my high school had made multiple anti-Semitic and racist and xenophobic remarks, with the understanding that obviously somebody who goes and commits a school shooting is probably not the most mentally stable individual, but knowing that racism and xenophobia and hatred are not mental illnesses. And in fact, if you were mentally ill in this country, you are far more likely to be a victim of gun violence than the perpetrator of it, because 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. And if we stigmatize mental health more by acting like people like the shooter in Buffalo, who was a self-declared white supremacist, are mentally ill, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and in making sure that we can actually address this substantially. But in Massachusetts, the way I think that relates is we need to address the poverty that's causing kids to pick up guns a lot of the time, especially outside of school, right? Because although this is the state that is least likely to have an instance of gun violence, just statistically speaking on average, it's still far higher than most high-income countries. We have to address how these guns are getting into Massachusetts, which is often from other states with weaker gun laws, and we need to address the poverty that causes somebody to pick up a gun. The reason why Parkland doesn't have a shooting on a daily basis isn't because we have stronger gun laws necessarily than other parts of Florida that do have shootings on a daily basis. It's because the average income in my community in Parkland per family is over $100,000, right? The best answer to help reduce gun violence overall, if I could do one thing and I had all the power in the world to do anything today, be eradicate poverty and systemic racism. That would be the two best things we could do to reduce gun violence in this country, along with laws.
So I want to stick with laws, and specifically, I just want to one more question about laws in Massachusetts, because I've talked to people over the years. Your friend John Rosenthal, founder of Stop Handgun Violence, who has a lot to do with advocating for gun safety laws in Massachusetts, has been a great source of mine over the years and educated me on this. And one of the points he makes is there's no sort of one law that does the whole thing, but what Massachusetts has done right is a sort of basket of laws: an assault weapons ban, a magazine capacity restriction, red flag law, background checks, safe gun storage laws. Police chiefs have discretion about who can get a gun license. Licenses are required to carry a concealed weapon, and others. But it's this basket of laws in Massachusetts that seem, and I take your point, that we need to do even better, but we do very well relative to the rest of the country. In terms of your goals nationally, is it a kind of basket of laws that might exist here in Massachusetts that we could somehow distribute across the country?
Yes, I think if I could do one thing today, at least from a law standpoint, it would be federalizing Massachusetts state gun laws. I think that is the single best thing that we could do right now.
Is that realistic? Is that
well, with this current Supreme Court, no, but it's okay because I'm going to outlive the Supreme Court. But I also think that it's important to take, honestly, some of the notes of how conservatives even though I'm not a fan of this personally, the way that conservatives overturned Roe versus Wade a lot of the time is basically taking over the entire judicial system as a counter-reaction to that entire movement. And it took them 50 plus years to do that, and I think what they did was awful, but there is a lot to be learned behind those tactics in that I think what we need to be doing is figuring out how we can start winning more and more state legislatures, getting young people to run there, and then passing basically different versions of Massachusetts state gun laws to see what we can get ruled constitutional currently, and then use those rulings if those laws get overturned and the dissents from those cases as the legal reasoning as to why they are actually constitutional when the court does come back in our favor, when we outlive the NRA and the Supreme Court and most of Congress.
I'm going to come back to laws in a minute, but I also want to sort of return to how this has affected you personally and what you've been up against. So the work you've done has made you a target of lots of people, as you mentioned before, the sort of pro-amendment group, and you're frequently trolled by them. So we're going to put up a graphic of a back and forth on Twitter between you and Laura Ingraham of Fox News. Ingraham had shared an article about you getting rejected from colleges and accused you of whining about it. You responded by tweeting at her corporate sponsors, which resulted in many of them, I think more than a dozen, is that right?
Basically all of them. Let's just say she had to take a hiatus involuntarily for a couple weeks after that.
Yeah, so there's Laura Ingraham's text and there's David's response. And what was the biggest takeaway from this confrontation with Fox News and Laura Ingraham for you?
The power of the free market against Fox News. And that we've seen this in all of the things that have come out. Thanks for bringing this up. A lot of people forget about this. It's like one of my favorite moments.
Can I just add one other thing? I'm tickled a little bit by her teasing you for not getting into some colleges. Does she know that you got into Harvard?
I'm pretty sure she does. I bet you there was some producer that came up to her one day, like before the show, like, "Hey, you know that kid that you like tweeted about? He's going to Harvard now." And she's like, "Shut up." I do plan on posting a photo when I graduate from Harvard, holding like my degree or whatever, and saying like what, like it's hard, and adding her, like Legally Blonde. Yeah, I cannot wait. But. Yeah, I think that's part of what's enabled us to really shift in the movement is moments like that, like basically turning that hatred and like obviously how awful it is that she would like, I'm kind of mad for my younger self. Like, yeah, I put myself out there, but look, I'm a survivor,
right?
And that doesn't make me immune from criticism. But to go after like some random kid when you have millions of followers as a 50 or 60, 70 plus year old, I don't even know, right?
No, it's
I genuinely don't know her age. I'm not saying that old people are bad or anything like that. We need many older allies in the movement.
You're just saying this older person is bad.
Yes. This one in particular really sucks. You aren't like the right now. But
so let me move on.
The point that I'm getting at is
is
basically learning how to turn that hatred into fun and laughing at it.
Yeah.
Right? and laughing at it, because if we're always just sad, we're never going to get out of here, right? If we're always just fearful and angry, we're not going to get out of here. What we have to be is angry and hopeful, and bring more people together and acknowledge the fact, like, look, there are some people out there in the general world, and maybe even probably some people here tonight that don't agree with everything that I say, and that's fine. I can respect that you don't agree with me. What I can't accept, though, is that we can't advance the shared principles that were laid out 250 years ago by some very flawed men, but nonetheless some sound principles of the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we do agree on, that we understand, that instances of gun violence and school shooter drills are completely antithetical to, that we do agree on advancing those and finding common ground there. And I want to figure out what that common ground is and make those advances. Because while many people think it may be despicable that I think that the Second Amendment is a collective and not an individual right, that I think it was given by the framers of the Constitution to the states to basically have what we consider today to be the National Guard, I also find it despicable that somebody could value an object over a child, right? But I'm still willing to find common ground with those people, even if we vehemently disagree on that point, because we have to make progress here, even if it saves a couple of lives. It's very hard to hold both those things, but that's what we have to do, is realize that we've always had disagreements, but we shouldn't let that stop us, especially in moments of crisis, from coming back around to our nation's founding motto of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, and forwarding what we can agree on.
So I want to talk about another encounter with the far right. This one famously with Marjory Taylor Greene back in 2019, before she was elected to Congress. You were approaching the Capitol in Washington. She actually chased you down, heckled you.
While saying she had a concealed weapon.
I was going to say, the next thing I was going to say, it's not a stretch. She didn't allegedly threaten you. She threatened you. So let's watch this.
Look, I'm an American citizen. I'm a gun owner. I have a concealed carry permit. I carry a gun for protection for myself, and you are using your lobby and the money behind it and the kids to try to take away my Second Amendment rights. You don't have anything to say for yourself? You can't defend your stance? How did you get...
So, I don't know, two things. This horrifies me too, because you said it, and so I can say this without being offensive to you, but here is a grown-up woman who's going to run for Congress and be elected, chasing, yes, you're a grown man there, but just barely, and a victim. It's so horrifying to me. Your sense of control is admirable. What were you thinking? Did you want to turn around and rip her head off? Why did you stay quiet?
Well, the honest answer is two things. One, learning from my dad, who was an FBI agent, the power, like, you always go to de-escalation first, especially if somebody says that they have a gun. Because my priority is not like, I know I put my life on the line doing this work. I think a lot of us, anybody that has any level of profile, including John, like you mentioned, John Rosenthal,
yeah.
We get threats, and we know that unfortunately right now that's part of the work. But my staff didn't sign up to have that happen to them, right? Like the staff that we have and the volunteers walking around with us, like Linnea, who was right there, who was just a random 18-year-old college student at the time, and was helping us set up those lobbying meetings. When she's like, how did you get all those meetings and stuff? The reason why is because we had an 18-year-old registered federal lobbyist with March for Our Lives who simply called those senators' offices and asked for a meeting. It's not that hard. And I was just really, I wanted to make sure that I didn't escalate the situation, because things like that unfortunately happened several times before. And I, every time, had basically responded the same way. And what I do now, a lot of the time, is I'll actually take out a Disney song and I'll start playing it. So like from The Little Mermaid, like Under the Sea, I'll start playing it because it's copyrighted music, and then it can't go viral. And those Disney lawyers will find anything. So that's what I've started doing a lot of the time if I just don't want to deal with it. Because it's, I'm not an elected official. I don't need to answer to people like Marjory Taylor Greene, and frankly, I don't really need to answer to, I don't have voters, right? I am a public advocate, obviously, but I'm somebody who just wants to end this issue, and I don't have a requirement to give Marjory Taylor Greene the time of day.
We have another question from the audience. You've mentioned before that you can be cynical. I think cynicism can be helpful in activism depending on how it informs action. How does your cynicism help?
Never assume any politician of any damn party is ever going to do the right thing, ever. In my view, the only good politician is a scared politician. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. I think a lot about what Hannah Arendt talks about. She's a really awesome 20th century philosopher, probably my favorite person from the 20th century. Total baddie, like anti-fascist. I remember that we're probably on radio, so I can't say what I wanted to say. But she talks a lot about this idea that politics is spectacle, and that if you try to look for deeper meaning within politics, there really is nothing, there's just more mystery. So to me, what that means is it doesn't matter what your meaning is in politics, all there is your actions. When I'm in Michigan and I'm talking with Democratic lawmakers that say, we have 2 packages of bills, we're gonna pass, one package now that does these more moderate considerations, and then we're gonna pass another package later. That second package is not happening, it doesn't exist. And it's up to young people and people from across the state, but young people who obviously I connect with the most because they're young, to keep the pressure on. Like when I was out there and I was speaking at MSU a couple weeks ago in the wake of that tragedy, we had students there from March for Our Lives who had just started a chapter there, and there were students at MSU as well who had gone through the Oxford shooting and now have gone through this shooting, a second school shooting, in basically 2 years for them, right? When I was up there speaking out, like at a rally that the students held, I said live on stage, guys, it's no secret. Your governor, Gretchen Whitmer, is probably running for president. Use that against her and hold her accountable to whatever she says so that you pass these laws. And from that, they were able to help change gun laws, right? With that too, I was there a couple months prior. I took a couple days off from school to go out to Michigan, or no, I didn't. I didn't have class on Friday. I went out on a Friday and spent the weekend in Michigan. I spoke at a tiny liberal arts college in Alma, Michigan of 3,000 students in a classroom that looked like a high school classroom, right? And I remember saying to them, if you all got other students from around the state to turn out, you could flip the state legislature to be a pro-gun safety majority, and you could pass gun laws like we're talking about today. And from that, because young people, not only young people, but young people did vote and turn out, they did flip the state legislature. And now, probably the thing that made me really hopeful about that was that after the MSU shooting, there was a student who reached out to me a state legislator named Jasper Martis, who reached out to me, and he talked about how he got involved in politics with the first March for Our Lives. He went to MSU and graduated the year prior. He ran for state legislature and got elected as a 22-year-old, and now is on the inside letting us know what's going on with this package of bills and putting up the good fight from the inside. That is what real change looks like to me, right? It's not just fighting from the outside, it's getting engaged on the inside, and it's doing whatever it takes to do that if you have the capability or even a slight chance like Maxwell did of doing so. That's what makes me hopeful, and how could you not be when that stuff's happening?
That was a great answer because we began with cynicism and we ended up with hopefulness.
I'm just the spin master.
Another audience question. Do you think most members of the NRA are in support of common sense gun legislation? And if so, why do you think they are not more vocal?
I think it's because most members of the NRA are people who bought a random membership to get into a gun. Let me answer that more specifically. Yes, I think most of them are in support of basic measures to increase gun control measures. And I also think that the reason for that is because most people who are NRA members, I think a lot of them don't even know that they're an NRA member, because they were going to a gun show one time and they were told, well, if you buy this NRA membership, you'll be able to get into this gun show for a lot cheaper than if you didn't, for example. Or they're part of an affiliate organization that the NRA counts as members. Not to mention, I just want to say one other thing to continue this spinning of cynicism into hope. When we started, the NRA had millions of members, and they still do have millions of members, but since we started in the past 5 years, they have lost over 1 million members. You know who's gained over 1 million members? March for Our Lives, just saying. Because when I came, the only time that I would see my dad come home from work before I came home from school was, I think, twice a year when he had to go to what we called quals or qualifications, where you have to prove that you can shoot straight for the FBI. And he would always be there cleaning guns and teaching me how to handle them properly and everything like that. I think that it's not an option of whether or not this conversation includes gun owners. It does include gun owners, and it has to. There are millions of gun owners who do support stronger measures, like my father, that the NRA does not speak for. But we need them to show up with us proactively every year at state legislatures to negate that talking point of the NRA that says that they speak for all gun owners and all this other stuff, because that's just not true. It's just that the silent majority of gun owners who do support gun laws aren't speaking out enough about it. And honestly, at this point, given what we all know is happening in this country with gun violence, if you're silent, you're an accomplice or you're complacent, effectively. Mm-hmm. So we need more people to be speaking out about it. And on the topic of suicide, I don't agree that there is any amount of mental health funding that is going to be able to stop a person like the shooter at my high school in the first place, because I think it actually would also do a lot of harm. I've met students, for example, when I've gone to different schools that said, I went to my guidance counselor and I care about mental health, right? I went to my guidance counselor and I asked them, I said, I'm struggling with anxiety and depression. Can you get me help or whatever? And they said that they got put on a list of potential school shooters, right?
Wow.
That is what I'm trying to avoid. That is why I don't like those conversations around mental health, because I do agree that we need to fund mental health more, especially for our rural communities where the vast majority of gun suicides are happening, especially for our young boys who are committing suicide a lot. And young girls too. It's just that the boys commit suicide they tend to do it with guns a lot more. We need to have those conversations. We need to fund mental health care more, but I don't want it being used as a scapegoat for white supremacists. When we just don't want to confront the fact that we have a severe problem with white supremacy in this country and systemic racism that needs to be addressed. And I don't want it being used to stigmatize mental health more. I'm mentally ill. I have PTSD from the shooting and the activism afterwards. I'm far more likely to be the victim of gun violence by my own fruition than the perpetrator.
Because we're talking about suicide, I just want to put this out there that if you or someone needs help, there is a suicide prevention line. You can call that by dialing 988. Just an important note there. Do you have everyone you need in this movement right now? And I'm thinking, for example, of young people of color, some of whom have advocated for a greater voice in this national debate around gun violence, with the idea that they are the most affected by this epidemic of gun violence.
100%. And I think, unfortunately, we don't need more of them in the movement because they're already in the movement. They have been the movement from the beginning. Unfortunately, we have a lot of activists in this country because activism is not voluntary. It's for many of the most affected by this that we've worked with on the ground with programs like Life Camp in New York City, with Live Free in Oakland, California, and many, many other groups of these organizations. Unfortunately, people have had to become super involved in them. So I don't think it's so much a question of how do we get more people involved. They're involved. It's a matter of how do we make sure that we're uplifting those people and broadening the spotlight so that when something happens like happens in Parkland, it's not, let's just make sure that places that look like Parkland are safer. It's let's understand that if Parkland is safe, but Liberty City in South Florida, which is neighborhood basically in Miami, is not safe, neither of our communities are safe. None of us are safe until no kid or person of any age has to live in fear of gun violence in any community. The other thing that March for Our Lives has done as well is we've worked with a lot of those students from around the country. One of the first things that students did is they went and met up with the brave youth leaders of St. Sabina that do work on the south and west side of Chicago at interrupting violence from this Catholic church. And we met with them and talked with them. We went to Chicago and met with them, the students did. And then they came to Parkland and met with us. And now a lot of those people that we originally worked with, one of them in particular, Trevon Bosley, has been involved with the organization for the past 5 years and now is on the board of the organization. And we've also done that around the country as well with other students too. But it's always a delicate balance because we want to make sure that those students are empowered and understand that they have a place in this organization and that this organization, isn't tokenizing them, but really giving them the power that they deserve and should have had from the beginning.
No matter if it's this movement for gun safety or another movement entirely, don't lose yourself in what it means to be human when you've already lost so much. Activists who lose what it means to be human, who refuse to see joy as resistance. I like that line, to see joy as resistance, who can't accept that they have limits, will not last, and neither will the movement. So this is a personal question. It's also a question about your movement, but you're still an activist. Have you managed to reconnect with yourself and what it means to be human? I mean, have you figured out a way to find that balance?
Yes, I have. And I think the way that I did that was, one, lots of therapy. Highly recommend. But two, it's also just having friends around you. And knowing that I truly am a believer in that. If you can't have joy in a movement, the movement will not succeed. You will not succeed. If we can't build a movement starting here today and going forward tomorrow that people want to be a part of because it's fun, it's inclusive, it's beautiful, it's creating a better tomorrow by leading through example of the world that we want to create as a community, by showing it in our own community within the movement of what that looks like, of joy, of reconciliation, of love, of justice, of understanding that just because, you know, mass shootings might affect my community more than daily shootings, I still care about daily shootings and gun suicides and unintentional shootings, right? We have to build a movement that people want to be part of because it's beautiful and exciting and it's changing the world. Not a movement that people feel like they have to be part of because it's an obligation and exhausting. If that was the case, if just being angry and fearful and becoming part of a movement was enough to end this issue, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. This would have ended a long time ago. It's incumbent on each and every one of us, regardless of whether or not you completely agree with me or completely disagree with me, to do more. To do more. Not just vote, not just tweet, not just post on Instagram, but get engaged, have conversations, have tough conversations, deep canvas with people. If you don't know what that is, look it up or read The Persuaders by I can't pronounce his last name, but just look up The Persuaders. And I've never ever changed somebody's mind that doesn't agree with me, specifically by going to them and stating, well, it's dumb that you don't believe in an assault weapons ban because these are the stats on how many assault weapons that were banned by the assault weapons ban of, X year or whatever I think it was 1994, were used in mass shooting. No. If you come at it like that, if you come at it the way that a lot of people, especially liberals, frankly, do on social media, where it's just, I'm going to convince you it's better. Facts don't change people's minds, unfortunately. The facts are on our side. Statistics don't change people's minds. You know what does change people's minds? Stories. You know what does change people's minds? Is listening to them actively and respecting that they have those beliefs and making them feel respected and genuinely doing that, but also accepting that that doesn't mean you're compromising your views, but it doesn't mean either that we can't find any common ground to move forward here on. What times like this call on us to do are like times before. They call on us to do more. People often, when I've studied history, over the past 4 years at school, I think we have a habit of looking back on it and thinking to ourselves, because we're all the star of our own reality TV show, that we would have been at the forefront of X or Y movement. But if you look at history, most people are not involved at all in movements. It's not defined by the Martin Luther Kings of the world or any of these major activists that you can remember the names of. It's defined by the organizers that you don't know the names of, that actually did the work, that may have been inspired by those people, but ultimately the movement were those people that you don't know the names of, that were on the ground. They were the people that were fighting against, segregation across the South. Kids, that went down there and helped register voters, for example, during the freedom rides and things like that, that you don't know the names of. You are those people. I'm one of those people. We all are those people. We have to decide for ourselves, though, what that engagement looks like and how we can sustain it, because this is not going to end until we can show people through storytelling and illustration of different art forms what that world that we want to build looks like, because so much fear that animates the people that fight against this so hard is a fear of the unknown. We as a people have to show the world that we want to build, a world where people like Joaquin Oliver, who come to America in search of the American dream, are able to achieve that dream and have it become a reality, and not have it stolen from them by an AR-15, and understand that that doesn't threaten you at all.